In this set of tutorials, we're going to be looking at how to sculpt stylized and realistic rocks. We will then go through the process of taking the sculpted rocks and preparing the meshes for use within a game engine. We need to first identify what type of biome our rocks exist in. So the area that they are and the type of material they're made of will greatly affect the shapes and sizes of the rocks. So for example, I want my rocks to be a very hard granite with sharp edges and chunky formations, not affected very much by wind and water erosion. But if you were going for a desert scene with sandstone, this is a relatively soft rock and may have been underwater at one time, and often in these environments you can find very smooth, soft, wind eroded shapes. If you are making an alien or more alien type environment, you can still take references from real life environments such as Giant's Causeway with the geometric rock formations, and this will still give you the opportunity to look at imperfections and odd weathering and stuff that is hard to come up with from your own imagination, even if it is an alien type landscape. So here I have split my island into several pieces of rock that I think will make up the bulk of the mass. So I'm going to select them all and export them all as an OBJ, ready for use in ZBrush. If you don't have the OBJ export option, you can go to Windows, Settings Preferences, Plugin Manager, and make sure that OBJ is ticked on. In ZBrush, you want to go to Import and find your rock OBJ and import that. And then holding Shift, you can drag that out onto screen and snap it to an axis. Next, hit Edit to activate this object. So now we want to separate these rocks onto their own layers and subtools. So if we hit Poly F, we can see that they are all currently in the same polygroup. So if we open up polygroups and go to Auto Groups, we can separate these automatically into their own individual groups. This allows us to go back up to Subtools palette, go to Split, and go to Group Split to separate these automatically into their own layers. So I'm just going to start with one or two of the main rocks for this so that I can go through the full process and take a look at what the style of rock I've chosen looks like in my scene. There's no point spending days sculpting the entire kit before I'm 100% sure that the techniques and the level of which I'm going to sculpt these up to is correct. So I'm going to select this rock here, and then I'm going to go to the little eye icon next to the rock, and clicking it while holding Shift will turn off all the other layers, and then I can hit it one more time so I've just got this rock visible. So the first type of rock sculpting we'll go over is stylized rocks, and how stylized your rock is depends on your artistic vision for your scene. So if we take a look at the dark side as rocks, you can see they're actually quite detailed even though they are stylized. They don't tend to go beyond a certain granularity of detail, and the flow and shapes on the rocks are very much accentuated. There is an artistic flow to the shapes of the rocks, and there are bigger bevels, fatter details, and if we take a look at some of the organic sculpts as well, you can see they follow the same principle. Anything that you might see in real life is just accentuized and made thicker and more bolder and even more aggressive looking. So let's take a look at some of the techniques we can use to try to get a similar look in our own work. Okay then, so as always I will make sure that I've got some sort of reference on screen, and the first thing I'm going to do here is I want to smooth the mesh of this rock off a little bit. So what I'll do is I'll go to geometry and I will subdivide this a couple of times to make this a little bit smoother. And then we will set this to be a Dynamesh. So I'm going to first of all just hit Dynamesh on the lowest setting, and that's just to see kind of what level it comes out of, because it's kind of sometimes hard to predict what Dynamesh will do. Now I'm going to set it all the way up to say 1000 to give myself plenty of detail to work with, and hit Dynamesh again. So now we are ready to start sculpting on this rock, and I have an overall idea of the shape I want this rock. I want it to be kind of pointy because this will be one that will stick out through the grass. So I want some upward kind of straight lines and a flowing shape to this, but still be quite chunky and jagged. So sculpting rocks isn't actually very difficult, and there's not many tools that you would use while doing so. It just takes quite a long time. It's the kind of thing that you might want to put some music on, sit back and take a few hours just to sculpt away until you finally get something that you're happy with. So the first thing we're going to look at is the few tools that we'll be using for both the stylized and the realistic rocks. So the main tools I'm going to be using to create these rocks are, first of all, I'm going to use a clip curve brush. So the clip curve brush is a secondary brush, so if we hold Control and Shift, you can see it turns to select rectangle, and that is this one. If we drag it out, that just lets you select a piece of mesh. But I want to change this one to clip curve, so if I hold Control and Shift, click on select rectangle, I can then select clip curve from the options. Now if I hold Shift and Control and drag that clip curve out, you can see we get this. Now this is going to clip the mesh towards the white line from the gradient side. So if we go like this, you can see it clips that. But if we drag it the opposite way, it will clip that way. Now you've got to be careful because it will clip to the silhouette. So obviously this rock at the bottom was bigger. So we get this. Now if we try to dynamesh this, we're going to start getting a mess. So you need to be careful with how you do this. You kind of want to clip smaller parts towards larger parts to avoid that. And what we can do is hold Control Shift and drag this out, and then if you hit Alt on the keyboard, we can create a point which allows us to have a bend to this, and you can do multiple bends by hitting Alt. We can get a sharp corner by holding Shift and Control, dragging out, and this time hitting Alt twice, and then that will give us a sharp corner for which to clip to. And what I would do with this clip brush is just go around the model, adding in some of my main base faces to kind of build out the shape of the rock that I want. And then maybe smooth out some of those bits that I've just done. So at the moment we're kind of just sketching, trying to get the right shape that we want from this. Now some of the other tools that we might want to use, for example, is say the clay tubes or clay build-up brush. So we select clay tubes here. What we can do with this is start to build out some shapes and get some randomness in here. And this can be used with the focal shift to make that more harsh. And then what we can do is use the H polish brush to flatten out some of that information, to take the top parts off it. And using the H polish and numerous brushes can get a good effect with this. So for example, if we find the flakes brush, we can build in some nice random information into this, and then using the H polish we can take that back down again, leaving us with just part of that kind of rough effect, and we can start to get some nice organic look and feel here. Now these two brushes are good, but the ultimate brush for adding detail to rock faces is a brush that is actually in the light box. So if we go to light box here and go to brushes, we can find the trim folder, and in this trim folder is a brush called Trim Smooth Border. Now what this does is it takes any angle that you place it on and flattens the rest of the object to that angle. And you can also hold Alt as well to bring the mesh outwards. And this really works well in conjunction with something like clay tubes. So if we create kind of some mess on here, just kind of randomize that surface so that we've got lots of different shapes. And I'm holding Alt here to dig into the rock, and you can just dig out as well. And then if we switch to Trim Smooth Border, we can then tap on this surface. So you'd more tap than hold and drag. It's kind of a stippling effect where you click and drag in little amounts and just move your mouse around to grab some of those different angles, and then you can start to get this kind of organic look. Now I'm going to change from this horrible red wax here to one of my favourite materials, just so that I can see the forms a little bit nicer. Now Trim Smooth Border really comes into its own when you start using it with alphas. Now with a realistic sculpt I'll use it with a detailed alpha, but with something like this I'm going to go to alpha and I'm just going to select a nice hard square brush, so like alpha 28, and we can even use it with focal shift as well to determine how hard that's going to create those edges. So at this point I think I'm going to actually increase the resolution a little bit more, so I'm going to turn this up to 1700 and re-dynamesh this so we can see some of them crisp edges coming in. Now that we've sculpted into this, if I start to use this trim smooth border with the hard alpha, we can get some nice shapes in here. And I can increase the focal size as well if I want that to be a little bit more aggressive. And the aggressive one is a lot better for realistic rocks. But what we can do is, if we basically go over this with a large setting on the brush, and then we can decrease the setting, the size of the brush, and start to go over it in a little bit more detail, and we can get some nice edges in here. And maybe even turn the focal shift down to get a softer look to the rock. So as you can see, we can get some really nice detailed and realistic shapes in here, but you can see that this is way too random, way too uniform, and already a little bit too detailed for what we need to do initially. So this is going to be a stylized rock, and the main focus of the beginning of this sculpt needs to be with the general forms, the artistic style. So you do need something in your head, your mind's eye, that you're going for. So for me, for this sculpt, I want a split down the middle with a larger, spikier chunk on the right side or the left side, and a smaller one on the right side. And that's the general idea that I'm going to try to keep in my mind's eye for this. And even though we can produce randomness with the brushes that we've just gone through, we do want to have an overall vision of how this is going to be at the end. So I'm going to go over this using those brushes that I've just shown and build this out to something I'm happy with. Now there's two other brushes that you might want to use. One of them is Orbs Cracks. Now this doesn't come with ZBrush, but it's a free download. You can find it with just a Google search for Orb brushes or Orbs Cracks brushes, and it's something I've been using for over 10 years. Now this is great for the end level of detail, but also if you want to put some initial cracks in. So if you know that you're going to have some certain information in this, so if you want to say, okay, this rock is going to have like some quite aggressive cracks through the middle, you might want to do the bigger versions or the biggest cracks in the initial stages, and then you can work into them more later on. But you don't want to go too detailed at this point, so you only want to put your biggest forms in. But this brush is also great to use for the final levels of detail as well. Another brush that we will be using is Trim Dynamic, and this is great for just getting some of those edges and adding some flat planes and surfaces and smaller areas of cracks. And this is really great for that stylized look. It's also a great brush to use on wooden stuff as well. One thing to consider before putting your detail on the rocks is how to distribute it. If you distribute the detail too evenly, there is nowhere for the eye to rest, there is no flow to the overall shape of the rocks, and it can look a little bit boring and man-made and less natural. Yet, if we cluster the details in a more uneven distribution, giving much more varied shape to the individual segments of rock and having larger segments, this gives the eye places to rest, it gives a more natural flow to the rock. And this kind of detail is often referred to as a 70-30 split and can be seen in much more than just rock sculpts, but also stuff like mechanical details, hard surface sci-fi modelling. It allows for places for the eye to rest and also for detail to be uncluttered. The same principle can be applied to the silhouettes of objects as well. So what I'm going to do is go over this and get this piece to the point that I'm kind of liking the overall shape, and then we'll look at the next steps from there. Sometimes you might find that you've sculpted some nice details into the rock, but they don't flow right with the overall shape that you want from maybe the silhouette of the rock. And in this case, you can use the move tool to massage them into place and just make sure that the overall flow works in the best way for what you want to get from this rock. You can also use the mask tool to mask out areas and to isolate them so that you can then sculpt inside or outside of that masked area and not affect the rest of it. This is really great for one side or another of cracks because it is quite hard to sculpt in a 90-degree angle, so in concave areas of rocks, without affecting the other parts of it. This is something that you'll just have to kind of get used to as you're sculpting, but it is one of the more difficult aspects of this. So I'm starting to get the kind of shape that I want now, and I can go over the hard polish and just simplify some of them areas, because I want to not make it too busy and kind of draw the attention to the more smaller areas of detail. And at this point as well, you might think that you are kind of running out of the resolution you need to get some smooth in places. So what we can do is actually go to Dynamesh and we can change blur to 0. Now when you do that and let go, it will automatically Dynamesh. So you might want to first of all set your resolution. So we set the resolution a little bit higher here. So we're only on 65,000 at the moment, and we're only working on this one rock for now. So say we go to 2,500 and then change blur to 0. That will give us some more resolution and it will neaten off the overall rock shape. So we can go over this and just keep on refining it, removing some of them edges. Now at this stage, if you want to do like an overall pass to just sharpen those edges up, you can take advantage of the clay polish filter here. So if we open that up, you can see you've got a few little options. Now if we hit this clay polish, it will just bring all those edges together and sharpen it up, and you can see that instantly makes it look very stylized. However, it is great, but it's very obvious as well. It does kind of give you these sharp but very wobbly edges, and we don't want our edges quite that sharp either. So I would use this sparingly and only for the initial stages, and I'd work in your own neat detail on top. However, with clay polish, what you can do is if you just want to sharpen up the inner crevices, which is the hardest bit to get sharp by hand, you can just mask these bits here, invert that mask, and then just sharpen those pieces. So you'll get some nice sharp edges just where you want them without affecting the rest of the model. So for this though, as we're still in the initial stages, I'm going to do a clay polish, but I'm going to increase the sharpness a little bit, and I also like to up the softness a little bit as well. So we're getting close to a shape that I like here. So I'm just going to carry on working on this. Okay, once you're starting to get the forms that you like, what we can do at this stage is use this rock to create more interesting shapes. So if you have made 1 or 2 rocks, you can start to combine them together, but you can even do it from just the same one. And what I mean by this is, if we just go to transpose tool, make sure that we've not got any subdivision layers, just center that to the rock. What we can do is hold Control to duplicate that rock out, but on the same subtool layer. So we can move this, rotate it, and scale it and intersect it to start to create some more interesting variations on the rock. And one of the things you want to consider when doing modular rocks is that the different sides of the rock should be quite unique. So you don't want it to look too similar from each side, because the benefits of having a modular rock is that you can duplicate this and rotate it, and it'll look like you've got more rocks than you actually have, because you can only see one side at a time, and it gives you a little bit extra randomization in there. So a great way to do that is just to intersect these rocks. So I'm just looking for an interesting placement here, and with that still selected, I'm going to hold Shift and Control and just cut away a bit of this rock here while the other one is still masked. And if you don't already, one of the things I am doing here is I always have my fingers hovered over Shift, Control and Alt, because they are in constant use as I'm moving around my scene. The faster you get used to holding your fingers above those shortcuts and not thinking about them, just getting it into muscle memory, the faster working in ZBrush will become second nature, and you can kind of forget about the technicalities and just get on with actually making some nice sculptural shapes. And then I'm going to go to Move and just kind of manipulate this into the position I want it. Now when positioning different rocks around, you want to make sure that you've got no crevices, like say for example this, that kind of make deep voids inside the rock, because this will be hard to kind of retopologize, hard to fix up later on. You want to make sure it's fairly solid and that any crevices you have don't go overly deep, which is a fantastic sentence. But yeah, just to make life easier for yourself, try to keep it relatively compact. You can get like deeper shapes by intersecting them afterwards when you place them in UE4 if you really need that, but for the most part try to keep it quite clean. Okay, so once you are happy with the intersections of your various rocks like this, it's time to merge these together. And what you want to do is make sure that you save your file first, and also do a duplicate as well, just in case you need to come back to this if you don't like the results. And we can go back down to Dynamesh here. Now we've already got the blur set to 0, and I've increased the resolution to 3500 here to keep it nice and high, because we will see like a loss of information. And the only way to kind of reduce that is to increase the resolution a bit, which is fine for this model. It shouldn't pose no problem. So we can Dynamesh that, and you can see we have these softer, blurrier edges through here. And one way we can sharpen them up, which is quite a difficult thing to sharpen up interior corners like that, but we can just mask all these edges off that we want to be sharper. And then we can invert that mask by holding Control and clicking outside the model. And then we can go to our clay polish and just hit clay polish. That way our interior angles are nice and sharp. So now we just need to go over the rest of the model using high polish, trim smooth border, and the other tools that we've been using just to get rid of any errors and sharpen up the final level of detail. Now at this stage you might want to subdivide this to make sure that we've got enough resolution to hold this detail. And also at this stage I will be using the Orbs Crack brush to add some secondary level of detail. So if I kind of make this nice and make it quite small. Now if you're finding that your draw size isn't going small enough to add the detail you want, you can always increase the scale of your piece overall, and that really doesn't matter because we're not using the scale for anything specific. We can, once we've finished this, we can resize it in Maya later on. It really doesn't matter. So if you need to be able to add extra detail, increasing the scale of this with transpose will allow you to add a little bit more detail here. So I might want to add some cracks along here, make them a little bit deeper, and then I can build out some of this. And what I'm doing here is just in a couple of areas I just want to add that extra level of fidelity to kind of sit next to the larger areas of smoothness, and just have a place for the eye to kind of move to. If it's all too fiddly and all too detailed, the same level of detail all over, then it's just going to look a little bit noisy and confusing. And then to finish off, what I will do is use the trim dynamic to go around the edges and just add areas of bevel. So I don't want all the edges to be quite so sharp, so I can go around like this, these bevels. Now a few of the edges that we put in here have softened up quite a lot, and I want to keep some of them soft, but I'll also want to come in with the H polish here, just run alongside each one of these and just crisp up some of them, so we've got areas where the edges of the rock are sharper, and then some areas where they're a little bit more rounded as well. And then go over this with trim dynamic, and I might add some areas where it's been chipped, so I can begin the chip like that, jump to H polish and just round that out a little bit, just tapping on it to make that a nice kind of chip like shape. And again just go with the trim dynamic around these corners and getting that look that you may have seen on a lot of rocks, sculpted rocks, especially stylized stuff. That just creates this nice detail around the edges, and make sure that the flat surface of your rocks are a bit more smoothed out. And you can use a H polish and the smooth for that. You want to get rid of any brush strokes because they might look subtle here, but they have a tendency to really be a bit more visible once you start highlighting those edges in Substance Painter when you come to texture it. You don't want to bevel every single edge. You don't want to go around everything with a trim smooth. If you have like a a chip every few centimeters, it's going to be really repetitive and noticeable. You want to try and keep some randomness in there. So I'm just going to go around the rest of this and add the kind of detail that I want. Okay, at this stage I might want to move on to the second level of detailing. So I could, first of all, I want to save this. And then what I want to do is I'm going to do a few more chips and scratches into this. So one thing I think I will add, so I'm going to add in some kind of smaller marks here with the Orbs crack brush. And I want to be careful of how much I add here. And you might want to add some other smaller details as well, depending on the type of rock you've got. Maybe even make some surface shapes as well. It really depends on what your rock's like, and you want to be careful with any features that are too defining and too obvious, because you'll more easily see them in the repeated patterns as you duplicate this rock around your scene. You might also want to check your rock in different shaders as well. It's good to see kind of how it looks with ones that have maybe pick out the edges a little bit more. So for example, one that comes with this is Pearl, has a nice edge highlight, and also there's a green matte cap as well. I think it is matte cap green clay. This is good for showing the crevices and the edge highlights as well. So that's pretty much it for sculpting stylized rocks within ZBrush. Now, if you want to see how to take this and add more detail and make it more realistic, then watch the next video. But if you want to be able to take this and prepare the mesh for use within UE4, then skip ahead to that video.